let's get to the actual nuts and bolts of how this is done. And I'll give you, and I'm going to switch sides here and say, and take the opposite view of why this is a bad idea. One thing that we do know, last December there was a lawsuit taken out against the city of Detroit because they had over 2,000, 2.5 dead voters on their rolls in the city of Detroit. Dead people on the voting rolls. And we also know in the same lawsuit that we had more people voting, or more registered votes, not voting, more registered votes in the city of Detroit than voting age citizens in the city of Detroit. So we know that those voter rolls are all messed up. If they're mailing ballots to everyone who's a registered voter, there's going to be a lot of fraudulent ballots sent out. Or if they're mailing even applications to everyone who's a registered voter, there's just going to be a lot of fraudulent. That does present an opportunity for someone who wants to engage in some mischief, in some voter fraud. Let's say people fill out those applications. And let's say for example, is there any safeguard in the system to prevent double ballots, double voting? Let's say, for example, you're registered to vote at your summer home in Michigan as well as your primary residence. Many people in Michigan have two residences. They have like a little cottage up north, maybe. What's to say that if you get two applications or two ballots that you don't submit them twice? Is there any safeguards, Hans von Spakovsky, right now in the system in Michigan or even in other states to prevent against this sort of thing? Can they tell if someone's voted twice?
No, because we know already they have duplicate active registrations that they aren't doing anything about. The Public Interest Legal Foundation actually issued a report at the end of 2018 about the issue you've just talked about. And in Detroit, for example, Detroit alone, they found 1,800 active voters who were registered more than once. That means that those individuals may be able to get 2 or 3 ballots and submit them. And since Detroit hasn't done anything about those registrations, they're certainly not going to do anything about the duplicate ballots coming in. That's a real problem, as is the fact that, look, that same report found hundreds of non-citizens who had been registered to vote in Michigan, and I have no doubt that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, that's one of the reasons all mail elections are just a bad idea. Plus, as we were talking about before, the problem of the kind of pressure and intimidation, particularly party organization, can put on people in their homes when they're voting.
And we know, by the way, that Trump only won Michigan by a little over 10,000 votes. So, I mean, you could swing an entire election in that state. Thanks to if people want to get engaged in some mischief because of this vote by mail thing. So this is fraught with all sorts of peril here for the integrity of our electoral system. What's being done about this? Is there any legal challenge to what the Secretary of State of Michigan is doing here with this, Hans?
I assume there may be one, but so far, I mean, she just announced this. I haven't heard that a lawsuit has yet been filed to stop this. The real question is whether she's got the power under state law to actually do this, and that to me is unclear. But no, so far I haven't heard that an election has been filed. And by the way, I keep going back to Wisconsin. Look, all these critics were saying, "Oh my gosh, turnout's going to go way down because they're not allowing everybody to vote by absentee ballots. We shouldn't have polls open. People will be too afraid to go in." The turnout in the Wisconsin presidential primary was virtually the same as the turnout in the 2008 presidential primary in the state, back when, as you recall, there was a very hot race going on between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, and yet turnout on April 7th in the midst of all of this was virtually the same.
You know, I can't help thinking that some of the mania for vote by mail is a preemptive effort to discredit the election or at least muddy the waters. And what we're going to hear is that if we don't allow widespread vote by mail or email voting or whatever they come up with, they're going to say, well, that's why we lost, because our voters were afraid of the coronavirus and they stayed home. So this whole election is invalid. And that might not be enough of a battle cry to overturn it or any such thing, but they're just going to go on like they have after every other election that the Democrats haven't done well in and say, see, we were robbed again. We had this in the bag, and they robbed us by forcing people to go vote and risk the coronavirus.
Oh, no, I think you're right about that. But I think there's actually a dual purpose. I think the dual purpose is, if they lose, is to make that claim in order to question the legitimacy of President Trump's reelection. But if they win, I think it's because they will have tried to take advantage of all of this, and will have manipulated the rules, frankly, to make it easier to commit fraud, to win these elections. I mean, you can see that in the fact that, look, Nancy Pelosi's bill that the House passed on Friday, you know, their latest coronavirus bill, well, one of the provisions in it would override any state laws that prevent vote harvesting and require every state to allow vote harvesting, which means the state has to allow any and all third parties to come to your house and pick up your ballot. So that means campaigns, candidates, party activists, political consultants, and guns for hire can all show up at your door to collect your ballot and, unfortunately, put pressure on you to vote a particular way.
You know what? It's interesting.
Yeah, I don't think people understand that.
Yeah.
No, I don't think they do.
When I talk to people that are not, people that aren't really political junkies, that don't follow this closely, when you talk to them, they always express surprise that voting can be as loose as it is. They don't realize how bad the problems are because the media constantly tells them there's no such thing as voter fraud, and if there is, it's irrelevant and it doesn't matter, and it's a few anomalies here and there. So they don't know how widespread these problems are. And when you start telling them how widespread they are and citing chapter and verse, as you've done with a few of these instances you've described, then people always say, how can this be? How can we live in a country that can sell millions of lottery tickets with perfect accuracy, but we can't use our data processing technology to get accurate balloting? Why does balloting feel like it's being done by little kids with crayons and slips of paper and shoeboxes in this high-tech information age? Why is it that our votes are so, loose? How can this system, we're so good at data processing, how can we be so bad at processing this data?
Well, you're right, and that's a real problem. And that argument is used a lot by people pushing online voting. Being able to vote over the internet, and they say, "Well, look, I do everything else over the internet, including taking care of my banking charges and all that kind of stuff. So why can't we do voting that way?" And they don't understand the huge difference between the kind of things we do over the internet, like ordering products or doing our banking services, the difference between that and voting. And they also don't understand there are huge amounts of fraud that occur over the internet when it comes to financial transactions. People just don't realize that because everyone from banks to retail establishments just bill the cost of that fraud, which they often have to absorb, into the cost of the business they're doing. You can't do that with the voting process.
Well, not to mention government programs like the various welfare programs, the IRS's tax rebate programs. They're all defrauded to the tune of countless millions of dollars all the time. And I think people don't realize that if we had the same margin of error in an online voting system, we'd never have an honest election again, not one remotely close to being honest again.
Yeah, no, you're right about that. And the thing is, listen, if by checking my bank statement, I can easily and quickly tell if someone has stolen my identity and stolen money out of my account. You can't do that with voting. If you're voting over the internet through your home computer, you will have no idea whether your vote got changed between your computer and its receipt by election officials over the internet, there's no way to ever know.